In the United States, some inmates aren't just doing time, they're studying it. They learn routines. They watch doors. They memorize staff movement. And in the right prison, an old, fortress-like facility built to keep people in, one weakness can become an exit. This is the story of a maximum security penitentiary in Iowa that looks like a stone castle from another century, and a planned escape attempt that didn't just shake the prison. It changed how people inside that town thought about safety, trust, and the job of keeping order behind bars. Because on one morning, two inmates moved with purpose, tools in hand, confidence on their faces, and a plan that depended on one thing. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the prison was already racing against minutes. And the question is simple, but terrifying. How did they get that far? Inside a place built to stop exactly this. This is Inside Anamosa, and the escape attempt that left scars the prison still carries. Before we dive in, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to HFD Achieve Crimes. Every bit of support helps us reveal the hidden truths behind the world's prisons and crime documentaries. Now let's go inside. Anamosa State Penitentiary sits just north of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, holding roughly 1,000 inmates at any given time. From the outside, it doesn't look like the kind of place that would ever dominate national headlines. It isn't built for visitors or curiosity. It exists quietly, solid and permanent, as if it has always belonged there. But to the town of Anamosa, the prison is more than a facility. It's an identity. For many families, working at the prison isn't just employment, it's tradition. Parents work there, then their children grow up and follow the same path. Neighbors recognize each other by shared shifts, shared routines, shared exhaustion. In a small town, institutions like this shape daily life. The prison influences the local economy, conversations, and even how people define stability. When the prison runs normally, the town feels normal. But that sense of normality disappears the moment you step inside. The atmosphere changes instantly. The outside world fades away. The architecture is old and imposing. Thick stone walls, long corridors, heavy doors, narrow routes that funnel movement exactly where it's allowed. Everything feels deliberate. Every sound echoes longer than it should. Even silence feels controlled. People who've been inside often describe it as leaving the real world and entering something sealed shut, where time, movement, and choice no longer belong to you. And that design creates a powerful illusion of total control. The walls look unbreakable. The doors look final. The entire structure sends a clear message. You are not going anywhere. It feels as if the building itself is stronger than anyone inside it. Like the prison doesn't just hold people, it defeats them. But modern prisons don't fail because the walls aren't strong enough. They fail because prisons are systems, and systems can be stretched. Staffing shortages, rushed supervision, and routine fatigue slowly erode security. Officers work long hours under constant pressure. Checks get faster. Familiarity replaces caution. And the most dangerous phrase inside any prison becomes, "Nothing happened yesterday." That's where vulnerability begins, not with chaos, but with repetition. Routine keeps a prison running, but it also teaches everyone inside how the system works. Doors open at the same times. Movements follow patterns. Supervision grows lighter in some places, heavier in others. Staff learn routines to survive their shifts. Inmates learn them because observation is one of the few forms of control they have left. Over time, routine stops being structure and starts becoming a map. Because a prison isn't just a cage. It's a machine. And every machine has weak points, not in the steel, but in the human parts that operate it. That's why this story doesn't begin with a dramatic explosion or a movie-style tunnel. It doesn't start with alarms or violence. It begins quietly, inside the routine. Because when routine becomes predictable, it becomes opportunity. And when opportunity is recognized, it becomes a blueprint. To understand how this escape attempt became possible, you first have to understand the person at the center of it. Michael Dutcher was born in 1992. His early life was unstable from the beginning. He and his sister were adopted and raised in the same household, and from the outside, parts of that childhood looked ordinary. There were family moments, seasonal routines, and memories that could pass for normal. But beneath that surface, people close to him noticed something else taking shape. Even at a young age, Michael displayed anger that didn't fade easily. When he reacted fully, without restraint. There were behaviors that crossed boundaries, moments that felt excessive, and a pattern of acting first and dealing with consequences later. It wasn't just misbehavior. It was impulsive, intense, and often difficult for adults around him to manage. Then came the kind of loss that can permanently alter a child's development. Both adoptive parents died within a short period of time. Michael and his sister were separated and placed into different living situations. At an age when emotional regulation is still forming, his world collapsed almost overnight. Stability disappeared, and structure was replaced with authority, rules, and supervision. That moment matters. When a child enters the system early, foster placements, detention centers, repeated discipline, the system itself can become the only consistent framework they know. Instead of learning boundaries through family and guidance, those boundaries are enforced through control and punishment. Over time, compliance replaces connection, and survival replaces growth. Records and later commentary describe Michael's teenage years as turbulent. He fought often. He struggled with rules. He was moved repeatedly through juvenile custody, sometimes more than once in a single year. Each move reinforced the same lesson. Nothing was permanent, and no place truly belonged to him. And more than once, he tried to escape. Not because the attempts were carefully planned or likely to succeed, but because confinement itself triggered resistance. Being contained wasn't something he adapted to. It was something he challenged. Running wasn't strategy, it was instinct. By the time Michael reached adulthood, confinement was no longer new to him. It was familiar. And familiarity, in cases like this, doesn't create acceptance. It creates defiance. Because when structure is all someone has ever known, breaking that structure can start to feel like the only form of control left. When Michael Dutcher reached adulthood, the system that had surrounded him for years finally let go. But freedom didn't bring stability. It brought exposure. Without structure, without supervision, and without direction, the patterns that had followed him since childhood didn't disappear. They accelerated. After aging out of juvenile custody, Michael briefly lived with family members. Those arrangements didn't last. Conflicts escalated quickly, often triggered by simple boundaries or requests. When challenged, he reacted physically. Authority, even from people trying to help him, was something he resisted instinctively. At 18, Michael received a significant lump sum payment connected to his childhood circumstances. For someone with no financial guidance and no long-term plan, the money didn't create opportunity. It created momentum. He spent freely, moved frequently, and surrounded himself with people who reinforced impulsive decisions instead of challenging them. When the money ran out, the question became urgent: how to replace it. That's where the behavior shifted from unstable to criminal. Small crimes came first: property offenses, quick gains, low planning. But crime, by nature, is progressive. What works once feels easier the next time. Risk becomes normalized. Consequences feel distant. And before long, the crimes grew bolder, faster, and more threatening. Robberies followed. First against isolated targets, then against staffed businesses. Each incident showed the same pattern: escalation, confidence, and a willingness to intimidate. Disguises were used. Threats were made. The goal wasn't chaos. It was control, compliance, speed. And it worked. Until it didn't. When Michael escalated to robbing a bank, the margin for error disappeared. Surveillance tied the crimes together. Investigators connected patterns. Within hours of public appeals, he was identified and arrested. Inside his vehicle, evidence linked him directly to multiple offenses. This time, the system didn't offer another reset. Trials moved quickly. Convictions followed. Sentences stacked. What began as short-term thinking now carried long-term consequences. Decades of incarceration replaced months of freedom. And with each sentence added, the reality became harder to avoid. This wasn't a phase. This was a trajectory. For many people, long prison sentences force reflection. They recalibrate. They adapt. They learn how to survive quietly. But for others, the weight of time does something different. It sharpens resentment. It hardens defiance. And instead of adjusting to confinement, they begin to measure it, studying it the way a problem waits for a solution. By the time Michael was transferred into maximum security custody, prison wasn't unfamiliar territory. It was an environment he already understood. Rules, movement, authority, consequences, and most importantly, limitations. Because when someone believes their future has already been taken, the risk of losing more starts to matter less. And that mindset would soon collide with the prison itself. By the time Michael Dutcher settled into life at Anamosa State Penitentiary, prison was no longer something he was learning to survive. It was something he understood. He knew the rules. He knew the consequences. And more importantly, he knew how the system actually functioned beyond what was written on paper. Prisons rely on labor to operate. Kitchens must run. Maintenance must be completed. Furniture must be built, repaired, and replaced. These jobs are assigned to inmates and are often seen as privileges. They offer structure, movement, and a brief escape from the monotony of the cell. But they also come with access. Dutcher was eventually assigned to a prison industry job, working in areas where tools were part of daily operations. At the same time, another inmate, Thomas Woodard, held a position within the maintenance crew. Individually, these assignments didn't appear dangerous. On paper, supervision existed. Procedures were in place. Tools were meant to be accounted for. But prisons don't operate on paper. They operate on people. Staffing shortages meant fewer eyes watching more movement. Supervisors were stretched thin. Trust began to replace verification. Familiar faces became less scrutinized. When the same inmates show up every day, follow instructions, and complete assignments, they stop being viewed as risks and start being viewed as routine. And routine is where security quietly weakens. With access to tools and increased freedom of movement, Dutcher and Woodard occupied a space that most inmates never reach. They could move between areas under the assumption that work was being done. Maintenance requests created reasons to enter restricted zones. And when staff are balancing dozens of tasks at once, those reasons are rarely questioned in real time. This wasn't chaos. It was normalization. The prison was short-staffed, overworked, and functioning under constant pressure. Officers weren't ignoring rules. They were prioritizing. And in an environment like this, prioritization can create blind spots. Over time, those blind spots became opportunities. Tools weren't just objects. They were leverage. Movement wasn't just convenience. It was access. And access, once combined with intent, becomes capability. Dutcher didn't need to overpower the prison. He didn't need to break walls or outsmart technology. He only needed to operate within the space where trust replaced oversight. That's the uncomfortable truth about secure facilities. The greatest risks don't always come from force. They come from familiarity, from systems that assume compliance because compliance has worked before. Inside Anamosa, the prison continued running as it always had. Shifts changed. Counts were completed. Work details moved on schedule. Nothing appeared broken. But beneath that surface, something critical had already shifted. Because when access, opportunity, and desperation intersect, the prison itself becomes part of the plan. And the system wouldn't realize it until the moment it was forced to respond. The morning began like countless others inside Anamosa State Penitentiary. Shifts changed. Doors opened on schedule. Work details moved inmates from one controlled space to another. From the outside, nothing appeared different. The prison was doing what it had always done, functioning through routine. And that was the advantage. For Dutcher and Woodard, this wasn't a moment of impulse. It was the execution of something shaped quietly over time. They understood which areas were busiest, which moments were least supervised, and how to move with purpose without drawing attention. When tools were gathered, they weren't taken in a rush. They were moved with confidence, under the assumption that work was being done. Confidence matters inside a prison. People notice hesitation. They question uncertainty. But someone who looks like they belong rarely draws scrutiny. And that morning, Dutcher and Woodard looked like inmates doing their jobs. Maintenance requests created reasons to move. Familiar routes created cover. Every step stayed just close enough to normal to avoid suspicion. Until it didn't. The moment the plan crossed into a restricted area, the margin for error disappeared. What followed wasn't chaos. It was speed. Decisions were made quickly, without room for hesitation. When resistance appeared, it was treated as an obstacle, not a variable. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about removing anything that slowed the plan down. Alarms changed everything. Once an emergency alert was triggered, the prison reacted the way it was designed to react. Doors locked. Movement stopped. Officers responded immediately. What had been invisible minutes earlier became unavoidable. The facility shifted from routine operation to crisis response in seconds. The plan collapsed just as fast as it had begun. Responding staff secured the area. Inmates were restrained. The prison went into lockdown. What remained behind wasn't an escape, but the aftermath, questions that couldn't be ignored. How were tools moved? Why was access granted? Where did supervision fail? Those questions echoed far beyond the walls. Because incidents like this don't end when control is regained. They ripple outward. They change policies. They change assignments. They change how officers view routine and how administrators measure risk. And for the people who work inside those walls every day, they change the sense of safety that routine once provided. For Dutcher, the outcome was final. The possibility of release disappeared completely. Any remaining future outside prison walls was erased. The system he tried to outmaneuver responded with absolute certainty. But the prison itself was left with something harder to resolve. The realization that strength alone isn't security. That walls don't compensate for fatigue. And that routine, when left unquestioned, can become the very thing that allows control to slip. This wasn't a failure of stone or steel. It was a failure of assumption. And it would leave scars on the institution long after the lockdown ended. Once control was restored inside Anamosa State Penitentiary, the immediate crisis ended, but the real work began. The prison entered full lockdown. Movement stopped. Cells were secured. What had been an active facility hours earlier became silent, sealed, and tense. Inside those walls, every detail mattered now, because every detail would be examined. Investigators moved quickly. Scenes were secured. Evidence was collected. Statements were taken from staff and inmates who had witnessed fragments of what happened. The goal was no longer prevention. It was understanding. How did two inmates move tools across restricted areas? How did routine turn into opportunity? And which safeguards failed quietly before failing completely? For correctional staff, the emotional impact was immediate. Incidents like this don't exist in isolation. They follow officers home. They replay during off hours. They change how people walk into their next shift. Confidence in routine is replaced with vigilance, and familiarity becomes something to question instead of rely on. Administrators faced a different pressure. Public scrutiny arrived fast. Policies were reviewed. Staffing levels were examined. Tool control procedures were reevaluated. Decisions that once felt adequate were now viewed through the lens of consequence. The system had to prove it was capable of learning from its own vulnerability. For the victims' families and the prison community, the aftermath was permanent. Memorials were created. Annual remembrances followed. The loss became part of the institution's history, shaping how future staff were trained and how risks were discussed. What happened could not be undone, only carried forward as a warning. Inside the legal system, accountability was absolute. Charges were filed. Court proceedings followed. Sentences removed any remaining ambiguity about the future. The response was decisive, final, and irreversible. For the inmates responsible, the possibility of freedom disappeared entirely. But the most important outcome wasn't written in court records. It was written into procedure. Facilities across the system paid attention. Conversations shifted. Access was questioned. Privilege was reassessed. The idea that routine alone could keep order lost credibility. Because this incident proved something uncomfortable but undeniable. Security isn't static. Safety isn't guaranteed by architecture. And control can never be assumed. Prisons are living systems, run by people under pressure, operating in environments where small failures can align into irreversible outcomes. The lesson from Anamosa wasn't about escape. It was about complacency. And for every facility like it, the message was clear. The danger isn't always the moment things go wrong. It's the years when nothing does. Long after the lockdown was lifted and daily operations resumed, the effects of what happened at Anamosa did not fade. Prisons are designed to restore order quickly, but emotional order takes much longer to return. For the people who worked inside those walls, the prison no longer felt the same. Correctional officers returned to their posts carrying new awareness. Familiar hallways felt different. Routine checks were no longer automatic. Every movement, every sound, every pause demanded attention. Trust and predictability was replaced by constant calculation. The job, already dangerous, now carried a sharper edge. Fear didn't announce itself loudly. It settled quietly. Officers wondered if they would recognize the next warning sign. if they would notice the next shift in behavior. If something small they overlooked might grow into something irreversible. In an environment where vigilance never truly stops, that kind of pressure compounds over time. For the surrounding community, the prison's image changed as well. Anamosa had always known the risks that came with housing violent offenders, but this incident made those risks personal. Families worried more openly. Conversations shifted from pride in service to concern for safety. The prison remained a major employer, but the sense of distance between the inside and outside world narrowed. Inside the inmate population, the impact was equally complex. Lockdowns tightened control. Privileges were reduced. Movement became more restricted. For many inmates, this reinforced the reality that when violence erupts, everyone pays the price, regardless of involvement. The system responds broadly, not selectively. At the same time, incidents like this become part of prison folklore. Stories circulate. Details are repeated and distorted. Some inmates view the event as a warning. Others see it as proof that even the strongest institutions can be tested. The meaning changes depending on who is listening. Psychologists and administrators understand this pattern well. Extreme incidents reshape prison culture. They influence behavior, expectations, and interactions for years afterward. Training programs adjust. Risk assessments change. What was once considered unlikely is now treated as possible. And yet, no matter how many reforms follow, prisons can never fully eliminate danger. They can only manage it, contain it, reduce it. That is the uncomfortable truth of confinement. Facilities like Anamosa exist to protect society from individuals deemed too dangerous to remain free. But in doing so, they create environments where tension is constant and pressure never fully releases. Every day is an exercise in control, balance, and anticipation. The incident at Anamosa became a reference point, a reminder used in briefings, trainings, and policy discussions. Not as a story meant to shock, but as a lesson meant to prevent repetition. Because when a system is pushed to its limits, what matters most isn't how quickly order is restored. It's whether the warning is remembered, and whether the next routine day is treated with the seriousness it deserves. As time moved forward, one question lingered beneath every report and review. What happens when prison stops being a punishment and starts becoming a permanent environment? For inmates facing decades or life behind bars, the concept of rehabilitation often fades into abstraction. The future narrows, choices shrink, and survival becomes the primary focus. For individuals like Michael Dutcher, prison wasn't an interruption in life. It was the environment in which his identity continued to form. Years of confinement reinforced patterns already shaped by instability and control. The system dictated when to eat, when to move, when to sleep, and when to speak. Over time, those restrictions don't just limit behavior, they redefine it. Psychologists note that long-term incarceration can distort motivation. When freedom feels unreachable, risk loses its deterrent power. Consequences stop functioning the way they do outside prison walls. The question shifts from, what will happen to me, to what do I have left to lose? Inside maximum security facilities, that mindset is closely monitored. Staff look for signs of withdrawal, aggression, or fixation. But even with training, predicting behavior isn't exact. Human responses to confinement vary, and prisons are forced to operate under uncertainty every day. For some inmates, structure provides a strange sense of stability. The predictability of routine replaces the chaos of the outside world. In extreme cases, prison becomes the place where individuals feel most capable, most in control, even most successful. The outside world represents failure. Inside, reputation and power can still be negotiated. That dynamic creates a dangerous contradiction. A facility designed to contain risk can unintentionally reinforce it. Inmates learn which behaviors command attention, which actions shift power, and which moments expose weakness. When an individual believes their identity is already defined by confinement, escalation can feel like assertion rather than loss. For correctional staff, understanding this psychology is essential but exhausting. Every interaction carries weight. Every routine moment holds potential. Officers must balance firmness with restraint, awareness with fatigue. The system demands consistency even when the environment resists it. Over time, the prison becomes more than a place. It becomes a closed ecosystem. Culture develops. Stories circulate. Past incidents shape present behavior. Each serious event adds another layer of caution and another layer of stress. The escape attempt at Anamosa fit into this pattern. It wasn't an isolated act born from chaos. It was a collision between psychology, opportunity, and a system under strain. A moment where confinement, routine, and desperation aligned. And once that alignment occurs, prevention becomes harder. Because prisons don't just confine bodies. They confine minds. And when a mind stops believing in anything beyond the walls themselves stop being enough. After incidents like the one at Anamosa, the conversation always turns to prevention. What signs were missed? What safeguards failed? And what could have realistically stopped it from happening? These questions surface not only in investigations, but in policy meetings, training rooms, and quiet conversations among correctional staff. Prevention inside a prison is never simple. Facilities are designed to manage known risks, not eliminate them entirely. Every inmate arrives with a history, a mindset, and a capacity for change that cannot be measured perfectly. Risk assessments help, but they are snapshots, not predictions. In Dutcher's case, the warning signs existed long before the escape attempt. A pattern of impulsive behavior, repeated disciplinary issues, escalation rather than adaptation. None of these indicators were invisible, but prisons operate under constant pressure, forced to prioritize immediate safety over long-term forecasting. That pressure creates trade-offs. Resources are limited. Staff numbers fluctuate. Training must cover everything from mental health crises to physical confrontation. In that environment, attention is often focused on what is happening now, not what could happen months or years later. And yet, prevention depends on foresight. It depends on asking uncomfortable questions. Why does a high-risk inmate have access to certain work assignments? How closely are tools tracked in real time? How much supervision is enough when staffing is thin? These questions don't have easy answers, but ignoring them creates gaps. After Anamosa, those gaps were examined closely. Job assignments were reviewed. Tool accountability was tightened. Movement protocols were adjusted. The system responded the way institutions often do, by reinforcing rules that already existed. But rules alone are not prevention. Prevention also requires awareness. It requires staff to feel supported enough to slow down, double-check, and question routine. It requires leadership willing to acknowledge that familiarity can be dangerous. And it requires a culture that treats near misses as warnings, not inconveniences. One of the hardest truths about prison safety is that success is invisible. When prevention works, nothing happens. No alarms. No headlines. Just another routine day. That makes it difficult to measure and even harder to defend when budgets are tight and attention shifts elsewhere. The incident at Anamosa forced attention back to fundamentals. Not just walls and locks, but human judgment. Decision-making under fatigue. The subtle erosion of caution that happens when a system survives crisis after crisis. Prevention, in the end, isn't about predicting one specific act. It's about reducing the number of paths that lead to irreversible outcomes. And even then, certainty is impossible, because prisons are not static environments. They are constantly changing ecosystems shaped by people, pressure, and time. The question is never whether risk exists. The question is how long it goes unnoticed, and whether the next warning is recognized before it becomes history. When the legal process concluded, there was no ambiguity left in Michael Dutcher's future. The system that had processed him since childhood now delivered its final answer. Life sentences replaced timelines. Appeals lost urgency. The idea of release disappeared completely. From that point forward, prison was no longer a phase or a consequence. It was permanence. For inmates sentenced to life, time stops functioning the way it does for everyone else. Days still pass, but direction vanishes. Milestones disappear. Goals shrink to survival, routine, and reputation. The future becomes an abstract concept rather than a destination. For some, that finality brings resignation. For others, it brings resentment. Correctional experts often describe life sentences as a psychological dividing line. Once hope of release is gone, behavior changes. Incentives lose power. Threats lose meaning. Control must come from structure alone, not from the promise of freedom. That reality places additional pressure on prison systems already stretched thin. Inside maximum security facilities, inmates serving life are monitored closely. Their influence matters. Their mindset matters. They shape unit culture, testing boundaries not always through violence, but through persistence. When someone believes there is nothing left to lose, every rule becomes negotiable. For Dutcher, the transition to life sentences marked the end of any remaining restraint. The system had taken everything it could take from him, and in that mental space, confrontation no longer carried consequence. Discipline became routine. Punishment became background noise. From the institution's perspective, accountability was achieved. Society was protected. Justice was finalized. But prisons don't stop operating once sentencing ends. They must now manage individuals indefinitely, year after year, with no expectation of change. That long-term management is one of the least discussed realities of incarceration. It requires constant vigilance, constant resources, and constant emotional labor from staff. Officers are tasked with maintaining order among people who have no reason to comply beyond force and routine. And routine, as this story has shown, is fragile. Life sentences solve one problem while creating another. They remove individuals from society, but they embed them permanently into systems never designed for static populations. Over time, pressure accumulates. Fatigue returns. Familiarity creeps back in. The prison adapts. The inmates adapt. And the cycle continues. Because even when the legal system delivers finality, the prison itself never reaches an endpoint. It must keep holding, managing, and anticipating every day without pause. And that reality sets the stage for the final question this story asks. Not about guilt, not about punishment, but about whether any system built by humans can remain perfectly controlled forever. By the time the legal process ended and life sentences were handed down, the story appeared complete on paper. The perpetrators were removed from society. Accountability was established. Justice, as defined by the courts, was delivered. But inside the prison system, the story was far from over. Because incarceration does not end with sentencing. It becomes management. Every prison must operate under the assumption that risk never disappears. It can be reduced, controlled, redirected, but never eliminated. Facilities like Anamosa are built to absorb that reality day after day, year after year, without breaking. And yet, history shows that no system remains airtight forever. Security is not a fixed state. It is a process that must be constantly renewed. Procedures must be followed even when nothing seems wrong. Rules must be enforced even when violations appear minor. Oversight must remain active even when routine feels safe. The moment any of those elements weaken, vulnerability grows. This is where the concept of a fail-safe prison collapses. A prison relies on people who get tired, distracted, overworked, and familiar with their environment. Officers rotate shifts. Administrators manage competing priorities. Budgets tighten. Staffing fluctuates. Training evolves. And through all of that, the prison must continue functioning without interruption. The incident at Anamosa exposed how thin the margin can be between control and crisis. Not because staff were careless, but because systems are strained long before they visibly crack. What looks like stability on the surface can mask accumulating pressure underneath. Experts often point out that most serious prison incidents are not caused by one failure, but by a chain of small ones. Each individual gap may seem insignificant, but when aligned, they create conditions where damage becomes possible. That reality forces uncomfortable reflection. If this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. If routine could be exploited once, it could be exploited again. If warning signs were present but unaddressed, how many others go unnoticed? The goal of incarceration is safety, both inside the walls and beyond them. But safety is not achieved through architecture alone. It requires vigilance that does not fade, discipline that does not soften, and systems that treat quiet days with the same seriousness as dangerous ones. The question is not whether prisons will face risk in the future. They will. The real question is whether the lessons learned from moments like this are remembered long enough to matter. Because the most dangerous assumption any system can make is that it has already learned everything it needs to know. In the end, the story of Anamosa is not only about an escape attempt that failed. It is about the fragile balance every prison must maintain every single day. A balance between order and pressure. between structure and fatigue, between control and assumption. From the outside, prisons appear absolute. Walls are thick, doors are reinforced, procedures are written, tested, and repeated. The image suggests permanence and certainty. But inside, control is never permanent. It is something that must be actively earned, moment by moment, through attention, discipline, and consistency. What happened at Anamosa did not come from nowhere. It emerged slowly, through familiarity, routine, and a system operating under strain. No single decision caused it. No single failure explains it. Instead, it was the alignment of opportunity, psychology, and pressure, factors that exist in every correctional facility to some degree. This is why incidents like this matter beyond the headlines. They force institutions to confront uncomfortable truths, that even experienced staff can miss warning signs, that routine can become dangerous, that systems designed to contain risk can also generate it if vigilance fades, and that no prison, no matter how secure it appears, is immune to human limits. For correctional officers, the lesson is constant awareness. For administrators, it is accountability and support. For policymakers, it is the recognition that safety requires resources, training, and sustained attention, not just after tragedy, but before it. And for the public, the lesson is more complex. Prisons are not isolated worlds. They are extensions of society's decisions about punishment, safety, and responsibility. What happens inside their walls reflects the priorities placed on prevention, mental health, staffing, and long-term management. When pressure builds unseen, consequences follow. Michael Dutcher's story ended with finality. The system responded decisively. But the larger question remains unanswered because it applies far beyond one person or one prison. How much strain can a system absorb before it breaks? How long can routine replace vigilance? And how many warnings pass unnoticed before they become irreversible? Anamosa continues to operate. Officers still report for duty. Doors still open and close. The routine continues, stronger in some places, more cautious in others. The prison adapts, as it always has. But the lesson remains. Control is never guaranteed. Security is never finished. And the most dangerous moment is often the one that feels ordinary. Because when systems stop questioning themselves, they become vulnerable to the very thing they were built to prevent. What happened at Anamosa forces a difficult realization, one that goes far beyond a single inmate, a single prison, or a single day. Prisons are often portrayed as places of absolute control, where every movement is planned and every risk is contained. But the truth is far more complicated. These institutions are run by people, shaped by routine, and strained by pressure that rarely makes headlines. Behind the walls, control is not automatic. It is something that must be rebuilt every shift, every count, every decision. When systems grow familiar, when routines stop being questioned, and when fatigue replaces vigilance, even the strongest structures can be tested. Not through chaos, but through quiet opportunity. This story was never just about an escape attempt. It was about how systems respond to long-term strain. About what happens when prevention depends not only on policies, but on attention, staffing, training, and human judgment. It shows how danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides inside what feels normal. For correctional officers, this reality is lived every day. For administrators, it is a constant balance between resources and risk. And for the public, it is a reminder that prisons are not sealed off from society's choices. They are shaped by them. The decisions made outside the walls echo inside them. Anamosa continues to function. The routines continue. The system adapts. But the lesson remains clear. Security is never finished, and control is never guaranteed. The most important warning is not the crisis itself, but the silence that comes before it. If stories like this matter to you, stories that look beyond headlines and into how systems truly operate, this channel exists to keep asking those questions. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.